What do you think, Robin? Should we get started?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm really excited to see such a big crowd. This is a wonderful turnout for a Monday evening. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the long-term trends of the coral community on Little Cayman and looking at how things have shifted over the last 25 plus years in both the coral community as well as the fish, and make some suggestions as to why I think we're seeing what we are in fact seeing in Little Cayman. So, as we're all probably aware, you're here in this room because you know a little bit about coral reefs. Coral reefs have undergone drastic declines over the last several decades, and particularly in the Caribbean, we've seen coral cover go from somewhere like 75–80% down to roughly 5% coral cover region-wide. And this is because of a variety of different things, and this includes things like overfishing, physical disturbance from hurricanes. So for example, Hurricane Allen had a major impact. The loss of herbivores like the diadema, the long-spined sea urchin, and parrotfish as well. Bleaching associated with global climate change and increasing seawater temperature, and also outbreaks of disease. And all of these have caused a major shift in coral communities across the region. And this has led scientists to really start to investigate, what is causing these major shifts in coral cover. And we've been doing this for, maybe 40–50 years at this point. And this is just a smattering of some of the studies that are looking at this type of data and, why is the health of coral reefs changing so drastically? What are we doing as a species that's resulting in this shift? Is it us? Is it not us? Is there something we can do to change it? And most recently, we're able to use a lot of data modeling at this point to try and look back at old survey data, compile that with new data, with the physical environment, and try to make projections of what's happening on a global basis. So this paper, which just came out a couple of years ago in 2021, is looking at how global coral reefs have changed over time. So we're looking at the beginning of when people were doing surveys in the water in the 1950s and 60s, and we have an estimated baseline coral cover globally at around 60% coral cover. Now you can see that by the time we got to the 1980s, the number of reefs that were below that 40% line were quite low, and that increased. So then now, of course, we have more studies, more people doing surveys in many more locations, and yet all of those are still at this lower coral cover, well below that projected baseline. If we look at that on a map, you can see that all of these areas highlighted in a warm hue are areas which we expect have undergone decline. So, and a lot of the Indo-Pacific, Australia, the Coral Triangle, and of course some of the Caribbean as well, and even the Hawaiian Islands are experiencing decline. Even though there are some of these hope spots or locations where coral cover is being stable or even slightly increasing, they're really masked by this larger scale decline on a global scale. And what is coupling this is also this loss of our fisheries. So not only are we losing our corals, but we're also finding that it's more difficult to catch commercial fish species. So here again, we're looking at a global basis, and we're looking at the amount of fish that were being removed from the sea. So this is continuing to increase, and then all of a sudden it starts to decrease. And if you look at that coupled with the catch per unit effort, so this is, say for example, if I go out and I spend 3 hours out on my boat and I catch 2 tons of fish, well, if I am now have to spend 5 hours to catch that same amount of fish, that is a lower catch per unit effort, right? So you see that the catch per unit effort actually started to decline in the 1990s, but the loss of the fishery was a lag behind that. And that's because people were putting more and more effort into catching fish. So they're putting more effort catching all the fish, but then eventually they're still putting all that effort and their catch is declining. And this again is indicating that not only are we losing the corals, but we're now also losing the fish. So the two things are intertwined, and especially because a lot of these heavy fished areas are dependent on the health of the reef in order to sustain that fishery. But there are some of these places where this trend is sort of stagnant or hasn't been as dramatic. And we're referring to these as hope spots as defined by Mission Blue. So these are special places with special abundance or diversity of species or unusual representative species, habitats, or ecosystems. They can be particular populations with very rare or endemic species. They can be a site that has the potential to reverse damage or recover from damage, or they can have be important for things like species migrations. For example, whales may be passing by and they're very critical for the promotion of certain species. This particular study here was looking at a series of islands called the Line Islands, and they were looking at islands that had different densities of humans along this latitudinal scale. So going from a densely populated island to a relatively uninhabited island. And you can see that in this vertical migration. So here on the bottom, you have an ecosystem that has the most heavily populated island, and you go all the way up to the island where there are no inhabitants. And the reefs look dramatically different from one another. And so they attributed this to potentially human impact was resulting in this decline of the reefs at these heavily populated locations, and the lack of humans was actually resulting in a much healthier and stable hope spot. Now, Little Cayman is kind of not quite uninhabited, but we're more on this scale, and because of that, Little Cayman as an island was actually designated as a hope spot in 2020 because it is an example of successful marine conservation. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the data that led to the establishment of Little Cayman as a hope spot. So here we are in Little Cayman, just a hop away on your little twin otter. 70 miles away, in fact. It's only 10 miles long and 1 mile wide, so it's quite tiny, and it's relatively low population density, only 160 residents on the island at any given time. And it's mostly undeveloped. As you can see in this image, the bulk of the island does not have anything built on it, which is fantastic. It's amazing. And not only that, but 57% of the coastal water in Little Cayman is under no-take marine protection. And this is really important. The UNESCO World Heritage suggests that we should actually protect a minimum of 30% of our coastal waters in order to achieve any realistic benefits from an MPA. So having an MPA that's 57% of that coastal water is phenomenal, and it's really above and beyond what really anyone else is doing regionally. So we should commend the DOE for that. At CCMI, we have been monitoring the coral reefs since 1999, and we do this on an annual basis. And we follow a standard protocol, which is called AGRA. It's the Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment Protocol. And this is standardized across the region, so many other locations are also doing AGRA surveys, and we can use this as a comparison basis for our data compared to theirs. And so they provide this really beneficial baseline data that we can track over time how the reef is doing. And what exactly do we do? Well, we are assessing the corals, all of the other things that live on the benthos, and the fish. So to do the coral transect, we swim along a transect line, and we have our stick here, which has 10-centimeter increments, and that way we can estimate visually the size of the corals. So I can just put my stick over there and be like 10, 20, 30, 40, and switch it the other way by 30, by how high is it, 20, and then I can get a volume of that individual coral. And we do that for every single coral that we encounter along our 10-meter transect line. We then have a small little square quadrat that we put along 4 different places on our transect, and underneath that square we estimate visually what percentage of that is live coral, what percentage is algae, what percentage is sand or crustose coralline algae or sponges, and then we can get an idea of the functional diversity of that area. And finally, we swim along a transect line like this 30 meters long, and we count every fish we encounter and identify it within 2 meters. So 1 meter on either side of the transect. Every fish gets size categorized to 5 centimeter size classes, and we take a tally so we can estimate the types of fish that are there and how much biomass they are encompassing. And using these data, we've been able to produce what we call our Healthy Reef Report Card. So every year, around this time of year, and this will come out for World Oceans Day, we'll see our 2023 Healthy Reefs Report Card, which will include the 2022 data. So every year we produce a report card, and then at certain intervals we will produce a technical report. So for example, in 2019 we did a technical report, which was the first 20 years of our survey data. And if you're interested in any of these report cards, you can find them through our website. So I encourage you to look for that if you're interested. So let's look at what we have found over time. So this year, or last summer, in 2022, we found 22% coral cover across Little Cayman. So this is great. 22% is great. If you remember, I said in the second slide that regionally coral cover is 5%. So having a 22% coral cover means that our reef is quite healthy compared to other locations. But there is this really interesting trend where we're seeing this like dip and then rise, and then it peaks, but then dips again, and then it takes a little while to come back, and now it looks like we're dipping again. And we think this is probably due to things like maybe a disease outbreak, and then recovery from with reproduction, or a bleaching year, and then recovery over a couple more years after that. So you see that there are things that are impacting the reef, but then the reef is able to recover. And I think that's what's really important, is that we're not seeing this continued decline like a lot of other reefs where they get hit by one disturbance and they just never get back to their base. And so the next time they're hit, they go down a little bit more, and then they get hit and they go down a little bit more. And Little Cayman has this resiliency which is unusual for Caribbean coral reefs at the moment. And we can look at this in a different way by looking at what we call the overall health state. So here we're looking at each individual site that we survey, what is the percentage of the coral on that reef? So is it less than 5%, in which it's considered a poor reef? Is it less than 10%? Then it's a fair reef. Is it less than 15%? It's a good reef. Is it more than 15 to 25? Then it's good plus. If it's more than 25%, that's an amazing, very good reef, right? So you can see that we still have some of these sites that are over 25% coral cover, and currently we don't have anything that's less than 10% coral cover. So that's really great in terms of the overall state. It means that in general, it's a pretty balanced ecosystem. There's no one site that's really not doing very well. However, we are seeing changes in our coral community. So when we started these surveys in 1999, some of the major players in our surveys were these large orbicelids, or the star corals. So for example, if you're diving here in Grand Cayman, those big boulder corals, which really make up sort of the standard reef that you would dive on at, say, Eden Rock or Dom Foster's, that's the orbicella. And it was the major dominant coral in 1999. And we've seen that pink box has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over the years, and now we are dominated by the blue and the purple, which are Agaricea and Porites. Now these two corals don't get very big. You know, they maybe could get about this large. They don't build a lot of structure, and so the functionality of these corals is very different. So from that standpoint, we are seeing some impacts to our reefs, and that could impact how the community functions as a whole. And we're not unusual in seeing this trend. So in this study, this was more of a theoretical look at why one community would shift from a competitive dominant or a stress tolerant dominant to what we're calling a weedy dominant. So in here, you're looking at, under ideal conditions, every coral is going to be able to thrive, and so the most competitive species is going to be the one that dominates. because it's going to be quicker at taking over space, it's going to fight the other corals, it's going to get more food, etc. And those tend to be these branching corals. Now, in a situation where you have a lot of stress, but not a lot of disturbance, so it's just kind of chronic stress, you end up with what we call stress-tolerant corals, and these are things like the orbicelids, the large, big, massive boulder corals. Now, on the contrary, when you start having frequent disturbance events, then you end up with what we call weedy corals. So the stress-tolerant are these domed morphology, the large orbicelids. They have high reproductive capacity. They are broadcast spawners, which means that they release their sperm and eggs into the water column, and fertilization happens in the water. And it only usually happens once or twice a year. And they have large polyps, and they're very old. So these are the corals that can be 1,000 years old, right? You have these ones that live in the ideal conditions, which have a very fast growth rate. They tend to have a branching morphology. They have large colony sizes, and sometimes they can be plating like the palmata corals. And then finally, we have our weedy corals, and these have a brooding reproductive strategy, which means that fertilization happens inside the coral itself, and they release a little larva that can settle immediately. And in warm locations like in Cayman, this happens almost every single month of the year for brooding corals. So they reproduce more frequently, which is what makes them weedy. And if we look at the trends regionally over time, some new studies are going all the way back to the Pleistocene. So they're looking at fossil records of coral community composition and how that has shifted over time. And you can see these different categories here, the competitive, the stress tolerant, and the weedy and even within those categories, we're seeing shifts in who's dominating. So for example, within the competitive species, we've lost the acroporids, the elkhorn and the staghorn corals, and they're being replaced by fire corals. And then you have, in the stress tolerant, the majority were orbicelids, the star corals, but a lot of these other players are starting to creep in, like the brain corals. And the weedy corals have really taken off. So again, these are the Porites and the Agaricea. So we see this dramatic increase in weedy species and a gradual increase in stress tolerance and a loss of the competitive species over time. Well, what does this actually mean? Well, it's actually a pretty large shift in the function of this reef. So you're losing your big, massive boulder corals. These corals are what make the reef. These are the corals that are building and keeping the island up with sea level rise. They're protecting our shore from waves and storms. So the loss of these large boulder domed corals will have major implications for the stability of island ecosystems. The loss of the branching corals is going to reduce habitat complexity. This is basically homes or shelters for all the little organisms that live within the reef. All the little fish, the inverts, the lobsters, the shrimps, all of those, they require this complex habitat. So overall, if we're losing these two major functional groups, your reef becomes flat and less diverse. So the fact that we are seeing this shift in species composition means that despite the fact that our overall coral cover is remaining high, we're still not completely immune to these impacts of global climate change and human impacts on our reef, because there is a change that's happening, and we just have to continue to protect that reef to make sure that we don't see any further declines. So what about the fish? Okay, we know the coral cover is high, but we're seeing this shift in who the major players are. So how does that actually affect the fish that live there? And this is where the story gets really interesting, I think. So fish density, which is in the green graph on the top, was pretty stable up until about 2017. And then it just took off. And all of a sudden, there were a lot more fish on Little Cayman. And if we look at the biomass, it doesn't actually follow the same trajectory. So that's kind of interesting, right? So we're seeing a stable number of fish, but the biomass was declining. So what does that mean? It means that they're smaller fish. There are a lot of them, but they're smaller, and we've lost the big ones, right? However, same time frame, the biomass jumps. So something's happening now where even the big fish are recovering in 2017-ish, right? And we can actually break this down and look at the different functional groups of the fish. So we have the carnivores, so those are eating other fish. We have corallivores, things like butterfly fish, for example. They actually eat the polyps of the corals. Herbivores, which eat the algae, and omnivores, which just eat whatever. And you can see that the major group that has shifted here and led to this increase are the herbivores. And we can then break that down even more and find out who those herbivores are. So in here, every color represents a different type of herbivorous fish. And so in 1999, we had a lot of parrotfish, a lot of surgeonfish, and some what we called other, because that made up everything else, but they were all in small abundances. And I think what's really important is in the last few years, this big chunk of light green, which has increased, and those are the parrotfishes. So we're finding a resurgence of parrotfish, which is great. Parrotfish are really important for the maintenance of your coral reef. They're the dominant herbivore on coral reef systems, and particularly since we've lost the long-spined sea urchin in the 1980s, parrotfish are really responsible at this point for keeping our reef clean. And you can see here, if we look at just the density of parrotfish, that growth has really taken off in the last 10 years. And so we're seeing, and it's not just one type, we're seeing all the different parrotfish species recover and increase in size. And it was started with smaller parrotfish, and now we're seeing these big boys on the reef as well. So that's really a good sign for the health of the coral reef. And I think what's really great is that we're seeing this in tandem, this decline in macroalgae. So parrotfish are known to eat macroalgae off the reef. They have these big beaks. They can go and scrape large chunks of algae and turf algae, make room for baby corals to settle. And we have actually found this yellow line is the density of algae on the reef in Little Cayman. So we found an increase in parrotfishes and a decrease in macroalgae, which is exactly what you'd expect, but I feel like ecology never works that way, so it's really nice to see that happen. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm showing a picture of sargassum because that was the only picture of macroalgae that I had in my catalog, but that is not an algae that is on the decline, and that's a whole nother story. So maybe one of these days we'll give a talk about the sargassum problem in the Caribbean. Okay, finally we'll go to the star of the show, and this is the Nassau grouper. And you'll recall that I said that even though the density of fish was staying the same, the biomass was declining because the fish were getting smaller, but then the biomass all of a sudden increased. And we really see that pattern quite clearly with just looking at Nassau grouper density. And so here you can see that there was a decline in Nassau grouper from the early 2000s down to about 2015, and then it started to increase, and it increased exponentially. And this is what's probably the most important point that I want you to take home, is that this, I think, is directly resulting from regulations that have been put in place on the Nassau grouper. So, in 1993, all of the known Nassau grouper spawning sites had been completely depleted in all three sister islands. In 2001, another site was rediscovered on Little Cayman that had not been fished since the 1960s, and it was heavily fished through 2002. Over 4,000 fish were removed in a 20-day fishing period. So that is insane to think about the number of fish that were being removed from that site. I mean, you go to that spawning site now and there are 7,000 to 8,000 fish spawning at once. So if a fishing boat is there, they can just take. This led the DOE to instigate an alternate year fishing law in 2002. So it was going to say, okay, in 2003 you can't fish, and then you can fish again in 2004. But by the end of 2003, they didn't feel that they had achieved what they had hoped with the 1 year pause of fishing. And so they made the decision to just extend that ban on the spawning aggregation indefinitely, which was a great idea. It worked. However, there were still declines, right? The grouper was still declining. And so in 2016, they extended those regulations to the Nassau grouper to be island-wide. So within the spawning season, you cannot catch Nassau grouper at all anywhere on Little Cayman, right? And there's a size limit. So the slot size of your has to be 16 to 24 inches, and a bag limit of 5 grouper per day in the open season, so not during spawning season, right? And the year here is what I think is really phenomenal, is that just lines up completely perfectly when we see this exponential increase in grouper. So we didn't see it right away. You know, it wasn't like in 2017, all of a sudden the grouper were back, but we're not monitoring the spawning aggregation. We're monitoring all the reefs on Little Cayman. So to see this exponential increase coinciding with these really strict laws, I think is a clear sign of the impact that these regulations have had on the grouper. Right, so again, here you can see, oh, here we go. I did include it. 2016 is when they initiated that strict law, and you can see that at the spawning aggregations, it increased pretty quickly. And then at all the other sites, it took a few years. So 2019 is when it really started ticking up island-wide in Little Cayman. So recovering at spawning sites began in 2009, 6 years after the initial ban, but continued to decline at non-spawning sites, which is our data versus the data at the spawning aggregations. And then we see this exponential recovery with new regulations extending its impact to the entirety of the grouper population in Little Cayman.
Is that extended to Grand Cayman?
The grouper regulations, yes, Justin, right. They're there are no known spawning aggregations left on Grand Cayman at the moment. We think there's one on southern side of 12 Mile, potentially one at Picklebank, and then potentially one, there's 2 on Little Cayman and 1 on the Brack, or potentially 2.
Potentially 2 on the Brack.
Yeah. So you can't fish during spawning season anywhere. Yeah. So what we found overall with our 25 years of survey data is that coral percent cover has remained relatively stable on Little Cayman, with currently 22% coral cover island-wide. We found that species composition, however, has shifted from these larger reef-building species to smaller, weedy brooding species such as the lettuce corals and the mustard hill coral. The overall reef straight has fluctuated, but it's remained relatively stable, and we have no reefs at present that are under 10% coral cover, which indicates that island-wide the reef is quite healthy. And fish populations have thrived in recent years with increases in density and biomass since 2016. And the largest increases were seen particularly in the herbivorous species and the parrotfish. And grouper populations have rebounded exponentially since 2016, with stricter catch limits were put into place by the DOE, which definitely is what we think is driving this recovery. And the most recent grouper moon, I know it was plus 7,000 fish that they saw at the spawning aggregation. So we're back to what was considered baseline, which is phenomenal. And with that, I just want to thank all of our funders and, of course, the Ambassadors of the Environment for hosting us to talk with you all tonight about these things. My research team and everyone who has helped with the AGRA surveys over time, including Rakeem, thanks for being here, and many others, because this obviously 25 years has been a long time. So a lot of people have passed through CCMI that have made this possible. And of course, Carrie Manfrino for initiating this project. And with that, I would love to take any questions. Yeah, Courtney.
A few.
Oh, okay.
Does it make any sense at all that Grand Cayman, first of all, does not appear to have collected the kind of data you've collected at CCMI over the same period of time, starting as far back at least, to compare the 2 islands in the same data that you've gotten? but mostly, what I'm really concerned about is, does it make any sense that we haven't completely banned taking any grouper in Grand Cayman at all? Grand Cayman has a very serious problem. We are in a whole different boat. We are that densely populated
Mm-hmm.
that is destroying our reef in many different ways, starting with severely overfishing the reef, way worse than Little Cayman did,
And development.
and development, and pollution, and the whole thing.
Well, I'll start with your first point. The DOE does do regular surveys of the coral community. I think that the difference is that they publish it internally, so it's not getting out to us. But they do have the data, so it is possible to do a larger comparative study with Little Cayman versus Grand Cayman.
And so why hasn't that been done and made a big deal about all the schools talking about it and in the paper all the time? You know, here's things we can do as individuals on the island to help with the pollution, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a great thing to initiate. And we have representatives here from the DOE tonight, so maybe he can put in a word so we can start doing those kinds of comparative studies. Yeah.
But especially the fish.
Especially the fish.
And I was really happy to hear you start with, talking about how the fish affect the reef as we extracted the fish from the reef, and that added to the decline of the corals themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because all I ever hear about is that climate change is driving bleaching and black band disease, white band disease, skittle-D, etc. And you're the first marine biologist I've heard who started with, we've overfished the reef.
Well, I think that's because when I was trained, maybe I'm older than I look, but when I was trained in Jamaica, actually, in like 2001, the topic of the day was overfishing, and that was what we were taught was one of the major drivers for reef decline was overfishing, and it's only become that global climate change has sort of leaped over that and become more of a threat now than overfishing is at present. And I don't want to belittle the impact of overfishing at all, because I think it is also has a major impact on the reefs. I think that at the moment people are focusing more on global climate change because it is so much, it's just so dramatic, the impact that it's having.
And yet, from my perspective, the one thing that we can all be doing to help would be to stop fishing the reef if we just know that we've already blown it here. And there's so many residents in Grand Cayman, especially all the new residents, but even the kids growing up, Caymanian kids growing up, who don't realize we have a problem.
Well, we could all die, of course. That's one solution.
Oh, yeah. That will happen.
We could all be vegan. There you go. I'm not vegan, I'm just gonna say that.
So I know you've done some work and research in Bermuda.
Yes.
Top level, what's the comparison? Are they surviving?
Oh, well, Bermuda is such a completely different ecosystem because it's so cold. So instead of having, the acroporids never existed there because they couldn't handle the cold of the winter. In the 70s, they tried to actually transplant some acroporid corals up to Bermuda, and they all died in the winter because the water temperature gets down to 17, 18 degrees Celsius, and the corals just can't handle it. So, and it's like months of it being that temperature. So, the coral community is almost all those stress-tolerant species. It's all the brain corals and the star corals. No branching corals at all. So the community is really different, but also Bermuda has very strict regulations on parrotfish and fish pots. You cannot use fish pots at all, and taking of any parrotfish species is illegal, and the fine is like $10,000 or something if you're caught with a parrotfish. So the parrotfish population is huge there. I mean, there's loads of parrotfish, but on the contrary, the Nassau grouper is functionally, or it is extinct in Bermuda. It does not live there at all. There's not a single one. And the black grouper is highly threatened, and that's the only real grouper they've got because they overfished it so badly. I mean, they're so isolated, they were reliant on fishing as the major food source for, decades before the shipping industry could catch up. So it's a really different system. Little Cayman is a whole different ball of wax. And I mean, if you think of Little Cayman comparative to other locations in the Caribbean too, it's just not something, it's unique. It's definitely a gem, I would say. So we're very lucky to have that here, to be able to see that. And even though it's probably was completely different in 1970, I mean, I bet what it looked like in 1970, there were probably sharks everywhere and, huge Acropora palmata. But for current day state of reef, it's one of the best you can get in the Caribbean.
About the world.
Yeah.
Seriously, how much does what you do translate, either in terms of solutions or in terms of identifying problems?
So there are other locations like the Line Islands, Indonesian locations that have low population density, low human impact, that also have very healthy reef sites. There are some locations in, for example, Palau, where the corals are living in 40 degrees Celsius water and seem to be doing fine. And so most of the science that people are doing in the Caribbean and also globally is looking at what is it about some of these corals that allows them to thrive? What is it about this ecosystem that's Little Cayman in comparison to other places that's allowing it to thrive? Why is there no stony coral tissue loss disease in Little Cayman, but there is in Grand Cayman? That's not a direct human impact. That's a waterborne pathogen. So how is it not there? There's something different about the microbes in the water or the movement of the water, the temperature of the water that's really preserving that habitat. And I think when you think of that on like a global research scale, that's how working in Little Cayman scales up, because we are this unique location. And so what is it about Little Cayman that's allowing the corals and the fish and everything else to thrive, including our regulations?
Actually, you made some conclusions, but no kind of recommendations. I was going to ask you what recommendations you advocate, for Little Cayman, for the future. Like, what changes would you recommend?
I mean, I think the major thing that we need to worry about in Little Cayman, I'm going to hope that I don't get myself in trouble now, but is coastal development, I think, and sewage. If we have too much development, too many homes there that are then putting sewage directly into the ocean, our system will change dramatically, no doubt. And so I think that is probably the most important thing we can do to protect the reef there, is keep development low.
So no new runway.
And marine, wasn't it a marina and all that too? They were talking
Certainly
about?
some of the biome issues or differences between Grand Cayman
Yeah.
and Little Cayman.
What about in comparison to the Brock? How does the Brock compare to Little Cayman? Is it on the same?
So it's kind of, the three islands are kind of like those Line Islands, where the Grand is the most heavily developed, the most heavily impacted. The Brac is intermediary, and Little Cayman is the healthiest. So it's sort of in between the two.
So could we possibly say that population is the major difference? Human population is the major difference? The density of human population.
I think that it's partially that, but also partially the marine protected area. The 57% that is not the case on the Brac or in Grand.
It's new though.
But it was already over 30% before, right? So it's always been heavily protected.
What's the population of lionfish there compared to Grand Cayman, in your experience?
I don't think that there's much difference. I mean, there are a few sites in Little that don't get dived a lot, where that you can always, like honey holes, you can get quite a few lionfish. And I don't find that as much in Grand. Like, you know, you can get like a couple of lionfish on a dive.
There's a few.
There are a few. There you go. But I don't dive as much here either, so yeah.
You got to go off the beaten path, definitely. But there are spots where you can pretty reliably come back with a nice full bucket.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I like to dive off the beach at Barker's and swim all the way out to the wall, and I usually come out with a full bucket there, yeah.
That's a good spot.
Yeah. Yeah,
Do
Tim.
you have the data that can tell us the difference between the north and south side of Little Cayman? Because they are structurally, from a coral reef, they're quite different. Where you've got the palmetto on the south side and more surge compared to the...
Yeah, we do. So we generally do 6 to 10 sites per year, and they are all encompassing. So they are all around. So we could delineate between. I just haven't done that comparison, but we could. Yeah.
Okay, full disclosure, I've done the acquisition 6 times with CCMI, and the south side is quite different.
Oh yeah.
And certain sites, you could see, just like your graph says, the rise and the fall and the cresting again. Places like cold cities that were 12, 15 years ago were terrible. And then they all of a sudden came back. And this
It's a great site now.
This doesn't look like the great same site.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, having remembered doing the south side a couple of years in a row, that there was even a shift over a couple of years, and we were seeing the shift on the north side, but more dramatic to, like you said, the Porties, the Asteroides, and but you weren't getting that sort of thing on the south side as much.
Yeah, and there are more. There are some really giant palmata colonies on the south that don't exist on the north.
Right.
I've definitely seen more wild cervicornis on the edge of the wall on the south compared to the north. But I generally see more fish on the north than on the south. So, yeah, unless you go off the wall, then it's like you're guaranteed to see some fish or some sharks on the south.
The difference in the population, fish populations, and be a function of what you're seeing in the coral coverage and the species of coral.
Yes,
Like, yeah, I think you
for sure.
some of that.
Yeah, and also because Bloody Bay Wall has been protected for a very long time. So that's a long-standing MPA site. So it's probably one of the reasons that the fish populations are so healthy there. Yeah.
I'd like to see it.
Yep.
Do you know if any studies have been done to look for chemical pollutants around the reefs themselves at the 3 islands?
Oh,
See if there's a comparison between them. I would expect chemical pollutants on the reefs in Grand Cayman, such as fertilizers, pesticides,
Fuel.
petroleum products. There's a wide range you could look for. I'm sure,
yeah.
that are the result, I believe, of my expectation would be the result of population density on this island.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the more there are of us, then the more golf courses and the more yards with pesticides and insecticides, that sort of thing. Herbicides.
I don't know if we're doing water quality assessments on all 3 locations.
Not so much on all 3 locations, but on Grand Cayman, DOE and the Water Authority had cooperated for quite a long time on water quality monitoring in a number of locations
Uh-huh.
On the reef?
island. And yes, on the reef. However, I do know that some time ago it was kind of put on hold because they weren't finding anything that they found significant. That is something that was recently discussed.
Well, that much is good to know. If they're not finding anything significant, that's really good to know. Back
It
when,
is, but it could also be, like with science, there are always ways that you can be just missing.
Yeah, it could be a
like,
manifestation of the way the data were being collected or analyzed or whatever.
if you
Yeah.
know where the fresh water is coming out on the reef, that would be a good place to look. Right? Because, there are specific spots where the fresh water is coming out on the reef. And when I used to shoot film, up until 2001, when these finally got good enough to go digital, but up until 2001, we were putting horrendous chemicals down the drain.
Mm.
Really serious chemicals. And that was just photography. I can't imagine the rest of society, what was going down. And we're always putting detergents and all cleansers down the drain.
Yeah, true. I think that all has an impact. And sewage as well has a major impact. There was a disease that started in Florida called whitepox disease, and it affected Palmata. And it's one of the few diseases that they were actually able to identify the pathogen and then the source of the pathogen, and it was fecal matter was the source of the pathogen. So, and it started in the Keys, where they basically just put their sewage directly into a cistern that seeps through the limestone, so there's no sewage treatment, and caused coral disease.
What is it on Little? Is it septic or do they have a treatment facility there for water?
It's septic.
It's septic.
That's why we don't need more.
I saw the diadema die in '84, and I knew what it was like before that. Did DOE record the population of diadema before the die-off and have something, a baseline to compare the recovery against?
Probably not, because I don't think marine science really took off until the mid-1980s anyway. And so people just don't have that kind of baseline data, especially not here. I mean, I think most of the data for that come from Jamaica. There was a Discovery Bay Marine Lab that was established in the early 70s, and that was where a lot of the critical marine ecology happened. That's what we all look back to as our baseline data.
I wonder if you could go back through your old stuff, Courtney, and go from your old pictures and video
Yeah.
and use
I
that.
never
as a-
shot video, but I wouldn't have anything, give you a
Yeah.
baseline on the diadema.
Mm.
I can just tell you it was horrendous trying to get out from shore at night to do a night dive.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
Gretchen, maybe our last question.
Okay, yeah, Rakeem.
Yeah, from like the ships that you said, from like functional groups,
Uh-huh.
from like the large reef building corals to the weedy corals, do you think that will have an impact on like the hydrodynamics? Say for instance, when storms come in, would that impact like its wave breaking ability of the reef over time?
Completely, because once those large boulder corals are not alive, they start to dissolve, basically. So they're no longer building up structure. They will eventually erode away. And so then you will have a leveling out of the reef. And then your waves are just going to barrel right up because they'll just continue to gain energy. Your shelf will be more of an incline rather than having a lot of rugosity to it. So the waves can increase in intensity as they approach your shoreline.
So like what does the weedy coral, does it have any function? Like, well, I'm sure it has a function, but like in terms of that shift that we're seeing, we see like the parrotfish are going up and the algae's going down. Are there like any other relationships that we're kind of like not seeing?
So if you think about like general succession, say for example in like a forest, if a forest is mowed down, then your first trees that come in will be your understory trees that recruit very quickly, grow, but then eventually the larger trees will come in and grow taller than them and shade them, and some of those will die out, and you'll get this transition between species. And that's probably, if the reef is going to recover, that's what will happen. So now we're with these understory species. These parietes are basically your shrubbery. And eventually, they're setting the stage for the recovery of the other species. So they have a function in that they're keeping the reef sort of going, and they're in this like stage of recovery. What needs to happen is that the conditions need to continue to improve to allow that recovery to happen. Otherwise, you stay in that early succession state, that sort of disturbed state. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, okay. This is the last one.
Oh, well, I want to ask if I'm not supposed to.
You can ask it. Go ahead, ask it.
I read an article, I want to say it was last week, but my life is kind of flying, so I don't remember if it was last week or week before, but it disturbed me though. Read it on CNN, and it was talking about how somewhere over in Europe, and I hate that, I can't tell you exactly, I want to say it was maybe Red Sea or something, but somewhere over there, where they were having a significant issue where a urchin, it didn't specifically mention diodema, it didn't describe it as a long spiny urchin, it was just saying that they were having significant issues where the divers were going out and literally within 2 days
They were all dying.
They're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought immediately, oh my God, that sounds like the diadema die-off that we had in the 80s here. And I was just curious if you know anything about that, and if that's something we need to be concerned about.
Yes, it is. And it has happened in the Caribbean already. The die-off started about a year and a half ago, I would say. And it's been reported at various locations, including Florida, the Virgin Islands. I think it's also been reported here at this point. The pathogen has been identified, in fact, so they know exactly what is causing the disease. But it is something that we are on high alert about. So if you do see fresh, dead diadema, I really encourage you to report it to the DOE because it's something we're quite concerned about.
Is there something that can be done about it?
Not really. Just keep an eye on it.
Actually, on that, do you think that obviously the protocols for cleaning gear and everything has so far seemed to work on Little, but do you think that's enough, or should there be some sort of a no gear that's been used over here? I mean.
I think I have a controversial viewpoint on this, but
subsidy.
if your gear dries out and it's completely dry, it's not carrying a pathogen that's going to infect your coral. So, and it really damages your dive gear to put it in bleach. So if you're going to let your dive gear completely dry out, go ahead and dive with it on Little Cayman. I'd be more concerned about bilge water and discharge water in a boat than I would be about your dive gear. Yeah. Thanks, guys. And keep an eye out. We will have a live broadcast of Reefs Go Live later this week, and also broadcasting from the Cayman Bay Cinema. But I think we're sold out at the cinema. Yeah. A lot. Thousands of little children. Yeah, there are a few seats, so if you're interested, let Robin know. Yeah. Otherwise, you can join us online for that. Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.